Hey, I'm Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and for today's long form video, I'm going to talk about balance in games. And almost probably I'll talk a little bit more about imbalance in games and the viability and actual importance of having imbalance in games at times, in my opinion. I think sometimes having certain elements of games be too balanced actually makes the games pretty boring. But not in all cases. So we'll talk about both sides of it today. So I'm going to share a couple examples as we go. And the first example is one that's fresh on my mind right now because we are releasing, you can see from the shirt here, we are releasing a new game called Stamp Swap here at Stonemaier Games. And Stamp Swap is a tile drafting, tile placement game. You can see it here with an I cut you choose element, all of which will contribute to, I think, the importance of having elements of imbalance in Stamp Swap. So you can see an example here. This is during the draft phase of the game where you put out a bunch of tiles and other cards and things that you can gather, not these cards, but these cards over here. And one by one players draft from the center pool. So drafting is one way, I think, where having everything be too balanced actually makes the game boring. If everything feels the same, then why do you pick one tile or one card over the other? And then after you draft all these elements, you separate them into two groups. And again, with these two groups, and you're presenting them to other players. So another player will choose one of those groups as their own. You get to keep the other one. If the things in those groups are pretty much identical in terms of value, grouping them becomes meaningless. It doesn't mean all that much to group things that feel exactly the same. And so when I originally saw Stamp Swap, it was working really well, but all of the tiles in the game were pretty much balanced against each other. They were very, very, very slight variations. Like there was a 2-point tile and there was a 3-point tile. So a 3-point tile would be worth more points than a 2-point tile. But for the most part, they were very closely balanced. And I found that it just made the drafting and I cut you choose decision space a lot less interesting in the game. And so we intentionally built in imbalances into this mechanism. And I think it works here because of the combination of the drafting plus the I cut you choose. Even if you get lucky and you choose a tile, there are these rare tiles in the game. Here's one over here. This is a 10-point tile. If you choose that tile, and it's not really luck. If you choose to get that tile, you have to put it in one of the groups that you're putting out there for other players to choose from. And so if you have this 10-point tile, it creates a really interesting decision when you create the group for it, because do you create a group just for the 10-point tile and then you have all your other tiles in one other group? Do you put it with a face down tile that could be a negative point? Here's the negative point tile down here. How do you group them? It makes the decision more interesting. And so Stamp Swap was one of the first times recently when I started thinking about the value of having imbalance in games, that adding imbalance between elements that in this case could be drafted and then cut and chosen actually makes the game a lot more interesting, in my opinion. And the converse is that it's actually pretty boring or less interesting, at least, if everything is pretty much valued the same. So yeah, that's one category here. I cut you choose is the category that I'm presenting here. The next category is card rivers. Whenever you have card rivers in games. And I have two examples here that I want to share really briefly. One is Arc Nova. So in Arc Nova, there's a variety of different cards. There are these sponsor cards. There are conservation cards. There are a ton of animal cards in the game. And these cards, I think, they're all really, really well designed. They're designed to give you instant benefits, ongoing benefits, end game benefits. They have when played powers. They have different costs. So as best as the designer could, I think the designer balanced these cards as best as he could based on these cost versus the benefits of the cards. However, there are cards, I mean, with a game with this many cards, there are certain cards that at least are circumstantially going to be worth more than others, and probably just by default, there are certain cards that are worth more than other cards. And so what Arc Nova does, and the next example does as well, is that it presents these cards in a card river. So you have the choice of many different cards to choose from. Another game that does this is Century Spice Road, which has a card river, and you can only gain cards deeper in the river by placing coins or placing resources on the cards that you're passing over to get to the card that you really want. So I think card rivers are a way where imbalance is not only okay, but I think it also makes it more interesting. You're excited when certain cards show up and other cards don't. And Arc Nova also gives you a way every round to flush out cards that no one is choosing. The other example I have here is Forest Shuffle. So in Forest Shuffle, there's also not necessarily a card river, but a pool of cards. As players are playing cards to that pool to play other cards like this. If I want to play this tree right here, I need to discard 2 cards from my hand, and those 2 cards that I discard go to the general pool. And so there are certain cards in Forest Shuffle that are at least perceived to be better than others and are definitely circumstantially better than others. If I'm going after a group of fireflies and the 4th firefly pops up actually even if the 2nd firefly pops up, that 2nd firefly is worth 10 points. That's worth a lot of points to me. I want to try to get that 2nd firefly. So that is circumstantially worth more than other cards. But I think it's okay, again, and even more interesting to have certain cards that maybe aren't designed to be more powerful or designed to be weaker, but that just end up being a little bit more powerful or weaker in a game like this because cards are constantly entering this common pool. And it gives you a more interesting decision in the game. Do you play a card on this turn, like maybe you plan to do, or do you grab a card from that another player just discarded, or that a card that's lingering out there a little bit longer than you thought it would, and you might actually have a chance of grabbing that card and adding it to your hand and later playing it. Having cards that are different values makes that card river, card pool, Century Spice Road style card selection, I think, more interesting. So that is the category of card river overall here, I think is helps with imbalanced cards and also makes imbalance more interesting than purely balanced all cards being balanced against one another. Blood Rage. I had to look a while to find a picture of Blood Rage that wasn't just the miniatures in Blood Rage. But in Blood Rage, you have a card draft. You're drafting, and not a public draft like in Stampshop. In Blood Rage, you have cards that you receive in your hand completely randomly. You're going to choose one of those cards and pass the rest of the cards to the next player. This is another system where I think some drafting games really try to balance these cards against one another. But I think it is okay and even more interesting to have cards in a drafting game where some cards are just inherently worth more than others. An example here is Tear Smash and Frigga's Grace. I think this is a good example. So these are cards that you would use in combat. Tear Smash adds +3 to your combat strength. Frigga's Grace, though, only adds +2. And there is an added bonus here. If you pillage successfully, raise another of your clan stats by 1. But that is a conditional benefit. Purely comparing these cards, I think for the most part, Tear Smash is more valuable than Frigga's Grace. And that is okay. That is okay in this draft because it makes this decision more exciting. Do you choose this card? Like, yeah, why wouldn't you choose this card? Unless you have this condition that makes you think about, okay, can I actually make this condition happen? I think also having cards like this in a draft that are slightly imbalanced against one another by design makes it a little bit easier for someone to play the game for the first time. If I get this hand of cards in my first time playing Blood Rage or my first time in a while playing Blood Rage, I may not quite understand the stakes of this decision right here, this condition on Frigga's Grace. And so I might just say, okay, clearly Tear Smash is a little bit better than Frigga's Grace, at least without that condition. I'll just draft this card. It actually makes a slight imbalance, makes onboarding the game a little bit easier for newer players or players who haven't played in a while. I'm sure you can think of other examples if you know Blood Rage much better than I do. But yeah, that category of Blood Rage, of drafting and using Blood Rage as an example, I think is applicable here for the value of having some sort of imbalance in games. Let's talk about games that feature random draws. I'm going to highlight one of our games here, Viticulture. So this is an example where all cards aren't necessarily imbalanced. And again, I think the importance of balance is overvalued in games like this. But where you need other things to counterbalance that if you have a random draw. So in Viticulture, you are drawing from 4 different decks of cards: Wine Orders, Winter Visitors, Summer Visitors, and Vine cards. And these cards are of different values. Like the Wine Orders are kind of balanced against one another because you have to, there's higher values of wine that you have to discard or pay to get higher points. There are a wide variety of Vine cards that are just, some of them are easier to plant than others. I'll get to the visitor cards in a second. But with these 2 cards, you might be looking for a certain type of card, a certain type of vine, a certain type of wine order. And what the game does to counter the random draw in the game is that it gives you a lot of cards. It is very easy to draw more cards in Viticulture. And so the game gives you a ton of cards. You have to decide which cards you actually want to keep and which cards you keep and when you actually want to play the cards that you keep. The visitor cards, though, early on in Viticulture's design, within the first edition of Viticulture, I didn't do this very well, where the visitor cards were, some of them were just strictly better than others. And some of them were unplayable at different times or were not worth playing at different times. So you might have a visitor card early on in Viticulture, the first edition, where a card would give you a bunch of points. But that card is pretty much useless early on in the game. You can hang on to it and wait till the end of the game to play it. But at the end of the game, what if you draw a card at the end of the game that is good for engine building that was only good earlier in the game? And so in the Essential Edition of Viticulture, the version of the game that's been out since 2015, I rebalanced these cards, giving a lot of like or options. Like you could, if you draw the merchant randomly in the beginning of the game, there is an option in the merchant that is relevant early in the game. And there's an option also if you have the merchant, if you want to save it for later in the game, or if you draw it later in the game, that is relevant later in the game. So it's kind of gauging engine building versus points. So I think in a game with random draw, I think balancing cards in this way is really important. Another way that you can also do it that I've seen in some games, I don't do it in Viticulture all that much. It's built into the board a little bit, but you can have a benefit for cards where if you aren't finding the card useful, you can discard it for a minor benefit that is still worthwhile at any point in the game. So Viticulture, I'm kind of using this as an example of games with random draw, how it is actually rather important that there are balance elements built into it, whether it's how the cards are designed exactly, or how the cards are used, or how many cards the game just gives you, how generous the game is with giving you more and more cards. Let's talk about asymmetry in games and the importance of balance and asymmetry. So an example here that's been on my mind for a long time is Tapestry. So Tapestry gives each players an asymmetric civilization and an asymmetric capital city met that has a little bit less of an impact on your asymmetry than the civilization. So I'm going to focus on the civilizations here. So I won't go too deep into the story, but overall, when I was designing and playtesting Tapestry, I tried to balance the civilizations as much as possible. And after Tapestry was released, we found that new players for the first time, would have perceived imbalances in Tapestry, but just first-time plays. And really, unless you are playing Tapestry many, many times, you become an experienced player in Tapestry, it's hard to truly notice anything that is significantly overpowered or significantly underpowered. But if you go deep into Tapestry, you play a lot, you will find that some civilizations are stronger than others. This is not by design. I was trying to make the civilizations as balanced as possible. But when you go deep into asymmetry, when you make things truly different than other things, there are times where even with a lot of playtesting and a lot of data analysis, there are things that are going to emerge later on that show that certain asymmetric elements are more powerful or less powerful than others. And so this is an area of design where I think balance is important. Make it as balanced as possible. And if you realize that you missed something, that you go back and you revise it. I think it is okay to revise things that you discover were a little bit imbalanced. And so that's what we've done in Tapestry. Initially, I released little things that you could do at the start of the game, gain some points, gain some resources, or subtract some points or some resources to make certain civilizations stronger or weaker. And then eventually we revised the civilization. So there's a revised civ pack, and in the new version of Tapestry, the new printing of Tapestry, we have the revised versions of the civs. Same with the first two expansions. So this is an area, asymmetry, where I think balance is really important. And one of the ways that you can balance asymmetry a little bit, or where you can lean on players a little bit, just a little bit, and this doesn't apply to Tapestry as much, is when there's lots of player interaction in a game, where if there is a little bit of asymmetry in games that is a little bit imbalance, which could actually make the game a little bit more interesting in games with high player interaction, then other players can help balance out that imbalance a little bit, where if you have a player that has the perceived strongest faction, or if they're pulling away a little bit in the game, that other players can interact with that opponent to try to pull them back a little bit. So that is one way that you can lean on players a little bit to help balance the game with high interaction. Worker placement. Someone recently asked me about worker placement. How do we how do designers balance games with worker placement? How do you balance one action space over the other? And I think Lords of Waterdeep is an example that I keep coming back to of a game that I think balances the actions really well. What Lords of Waterdeep does is it presents the economy of the game in complete clarity on the board. It shows you that an action space that gives you two, like if you place a worker, you gain 2 black cubes. If you place a worker, you gain 1 white cube. And I think it's 1 purple, 2 orange. So you see up front from the very start, that is the economic value of the different elements of the game. However, Lords of Waterdeep then adds layers by letting players construct buildings. There are these building tiles down here that completely change the math. But players have to choose to build those buildings. They're still limited in terms of only one player can go there per round. And one other variable element of the game, in this game in particular, is that you can choose, or you have some power, some agency over who is the first player. So if you do end up having these action spaces that are more valuable than the ones that you started with, you can say, okay, I really need to go to this action next round first. I need to get there before any other player. I can choose this round to claim the first player token. No one else can take that away from me. I have it. Yes, I'm sacrificing something this round, but I really need to get this tile that went out there. The game also balances that a little bit by having the player who controlled that tile, who built that tile, they get a benefit every time someone else uses it. So there's an incentive that balances out too. So yes, even though I have built something that's really powerful, I get a little benefit from it. You're gaining this powerful benefit, but it's balanced a little bit against me as another player because I get this little bonus whenever you use the action space. But I think Lords of Waterdeep, there's no formula, I think, to balancing every worker placement action space and every worker placement game. But I think Lords of Waterdeep presents a nice way to do it, where you have actually very basic action spaces that convey the economy of the game, and then ways to expand upon that and change the economy of the game by building more action spaces during the game itself. I think that's a good example of worker placement, trying to balance it, but also adding intentional imbalance through those buildings. So what about games with imbalance through luck? And how this can result in the need for catch-up mechanisms. I think Quacks of Quedlinburg is a game that does this, maybe not perfectly, but I think pretty well, and at least in an interesting way. So there are games that feature luck, push your luck games in particular, where a player can just get lucky and they can start to pull away from the other players in the game. And Quacks of Quedlinburg has this. This is a thing that can happen in Quacks, where a player can push their luck, or like every token they draw out of their bag are the good tokens. They hardly ever draw the bad tokens. They are getting resources. They're getting points. Feels great for them. But for the other players, it may not feel as good. But the game balances this a little bit through these rat tails. This is a clever catch-up mechanism, in my opinion, where if I fall behind, so say I am not doing well at earning points. My token is on the 1 right here, and you're all the way up here on the 15. When it comes time to start a new round, we count the number of rat tails between your token and my tokens. That'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 rat tails. And what this does, this number 6, means that I get to move a little token on my my cauldron track. I get to move it up to 6 spaces from my starting token before the beginning of the round. So I get to start with a big benefit at the beginning of the round based on this difference between you and me. Which it just gives me a really nice head start for the next round. It gives me a better point scoring potential, a better a currency gaining potential, and even the possibility of having the best score in that round. And I get to roll a die and get a little bonus. So I think catch-up mechanisms like this, when elegantly presented, provide ways for you to build imbalance into the game, or at least allow for some imbalance in the game, in this case through luck, and still allow players to have a good time in the game. And again, I keep saying this both ways. Like I'm explaining ways to counteract imbalances in games, but also I think all these ways give you permission as a designer to include elements that aren't exactly balanced, that are pretty close, but aren't exactly balanced, and how that can actually make the game more interesting. If you make a game with luck that is perfectly balanced, that is not as, I don't think that is as interesting as a game with luck where a little bit of luck actually matters, where it feels good to roll something really well, or feels good to draw something out of the bag that is better than the previous time that you played, or better than another player even at the table. The next example, we have 3 more, are cooperative games. So I've talked a lot about competitive games so far, but in cooperative games, I think balance is a little bit different. Like the need for balance is a little bit lower than in competitive games because you're all in it together. So I'm going to showcase 2 examples of cooperative games where there's 2 different types of imbalance built into the game, and that actually makes the game, in my opinion, more interesting. The first is in Mysterium Park. In Mysterium Park, there is an inherent imbalance of information that makes the game interesting. One player plays as the spirit, the ghost. They are communicating through images with all other players, so they have they have perfect information in the game, but they can't communicate. Whereas all other players can communicate openly with each other, but they have very little information. The only information they have, as they deduce who the murder suspect wasn't and who the and where it didn't happen. All they have are these cards with these eerie illustrations on them given to them by the spirit. And so I think asymmetric elements in cooperative games don't have to be perfectly balanced. And in this case, I think the game is much more interesting because of the strong imbalance between the spirit and the other players. The other type of cooperative game are games where you're playing somewhat against the AI. Sleeping Gods, I think, does a good job of walking the line between letting players do what they want and also having a somewhat antagonistic AI, but you're walking into things in Sleeping Gods. There's lots of other games where you're just fighting against the AI. But in Sleeping Gods, the characters can end up being quite imbalanced against one another. Like from the start, they don't have to be perfectly designed because you're splitting up 9 different characters amongst up to 4 players. And also, as you play, different characters may level up. Like this character has a card that makes this character a little bit better. You might go all in on a character, make a certain character really, really powerful, and have another character that's weaker. And that is okay in a cooperative game because you're all working together towards a common goal. I think, so I think in cooperative games, I think it's helpful to have relatively close asymmetric balance at the beginning of the game. So you don't have a character that is just always necessary to use or always necessary to play, especially in a game where you aren't using all the characters. But I think it is okay in a cooperative game to have characters not be exactly balanced against one another. And that could actually make the game a little bit more interesting. Do we play this time? Do we make the game a little bit harder by playing with a weaker character or against a harder or more difficult opponent, like in a game like Spirit Island or in Spirit Island is a good example. And then you add different complexity scores in the game like that to show, or difficulty scores to show, okay, this opponent is more difficult than the other ones. This character is more complex or less complex than the other characters. So that's cooperative games. Let's talk a little bit about parity. And I do have a long video about parity that you can check out. Or not necessarily a long video, but a video with a lot of examples about parity. But a recent game that came to mind when I thought about parity is Compile. Compile is a dueling game, kind of a tug-of-war dueling game where each player has 3 asymmetric factions. And those factions give you cards like this that are numbered typically, 0 through 5. We're missing the 4 here, but they're numbered 0 through 5. The 5 is inherently better in terms of its number than other cards because you're trying to win these tug-of-war battles where you're trying to reach a threshold of at least 10 and then take a compile turn to have that, if that number is higher than your opponent's strength on that same kind of arena in the game. So 5 is better, but the designer did something really clever in this game where they balanced these higher numbers with weaker abilities and even sometimes abilities that you don't want to use. So example for this Water 5, it requires you to discard a card. And in this game, you need cards. You don't want to discard cards. So, and then on the lower numbers, let's see, with a 1 is a much weaker number, but I get to draw 2 cards when I do it. It also gives me an ongoing ability up here. So I think parity is a way that you can offer a lot of imbalanced abilities. I think Compile is interesting because the abilities are not balanced. Draw 2 cards is inherently so much better than discarding a card, but because that those imbalanced abilities are put on the same cards or put on cards with different numbers, that level of parity helps to balance the numbers in the games. And the same thing goes if you have any game where you are like placing dice or rolling dice, giving high numbers of dice a value or a utility is also just as important as giving low-numbered dice a value or utility in those games as well. So check out that video on parity if this is a topic that's interesting to you. It's a way to add imbalance to a game, but also keep it balanced. Do a little bit of both. The last example I have here is of another Stonemaier game, and we're talking about player scaling balance, making sure the game scales well at different player counts. I think is different than having the game be perfectly balanced at all player counts. I think it is okay for games to feel different at different player counts. And I think sometimes when games go out of their way to say, okay, you got to do all these different things during setup to make sure the game feels the same at 2 players as it does at 5 players, I think that can kind of be annoying. That can make a game harder to get the game to the table. Setup is one thing. Sometimes it's even an ongoing thing during the game that you need to pay attention to during the game. But in expeditions, this is something that I did hear from certain people playing the game, that they wished that the game felt a little bit more similar from 2 players to 5 players, that those different player counts did feel a little bit closer to one another. And I hear that. But at the same time, I think it is okay for the game to feel different. I think it's okay in a 2-player game for there to be maybe less of the map revealed. You have fewer explorers walking around. They are literally exploring less. Whereas in a 5-player game, it's a lot tighter. It's a lot more crowded. I think that's okay for it to feel different. The analogy that I sometimes use is if I have a room, if I'm in a room with just one other person, the vibe of that room is going to feel different than if there are 20 people in that room. Like there's less space in there. It's louder. It's going to feel different. It's okay for those 2 things to feel different because they are different environments. They're different circumstances. So I think player scaling is sometimes an area where designers maybe go over the edge of being a little bit annoying to players in terms of how much they try to balance it compared to other player counts. Whereas I think it is okay for games to feel different at different player counts. I think that is okay. So yeah, those are 10 different areas of balance that I wanted to talk about today, and really to touch upon a number of areas where ways to balance games, but also ways to build in relatively minor, sometimes even major imbalances. In Stamp Shop, we have these rare stamps that are worth way more than other stamps. Depending on the mechanisms, you can add those imbalances into games, and that can actually make the game more interesting. I think balance can sometimes be boring, and acknowledging that these different methods of building imbalance into the game can actually make for some really fun games, in my opinion. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have thoughts in the comments, I totally understand if you disagree with this opinion. I respect that. But give me some examples if you can of why you disagree. And if you have other examples of games that aren't balanced in your opinion, but they are more fun because they aren't balanced, I'd love to hear some of your examples and your favorites in the comments below. Thanks.